Hi everyone, and welcome back to In Plain Terms. For those of you who are new here, thanks for joining me. This is a fun podcast where I will be breaking down one of Shakespeare's plays in an easy and fun way. My name is Alice Bloomer. I'm not a professor or an academic, I'm simply an actor who believes Shakespeare is for everyone, not just the educated elite. First, I'll break down the play whilst briefly touching on some of the play's themes. Then I'll share some of the top insults in the play. I will do all of this while making some terrible jokes and just having a good time. This week, we will be covering Henry IV Part 1. I know, not the histories, but they're so boring. Wrong. They are the original Game of Thrones or Lord of the Rings. You can choose your epic to compare it to. Michelle Terry, reigning queen of Shakespeare's Globe in London, calls it the original box set. There was no HBO back then, so we couldn't cry over which Stark was killed, or guess who was going to sit on that infamous throne of swords, so old Shaky had to entertain the masses somehow. First, let's just get a snapshot of the events before we get into the summary. Beginning, King Henry IV is moody, Hotspur is moodier, there's a lot of arguing, and Prince Hal is drunk. Middle, Hal gets in trouble with Dad and promises to be better, Falstaff gets drafted and they all prepare for war. End. Big battle. Hal and Hotspur confront, and Hal wins. Falstaff takes the credit and gets a promotion. So, beginning. Henry IV is like, okay, I'm king now, and I'm done with civil war. The country needs a break, so we're going to fight in the Holy Land, uniting under a common enemy for the win. Then he finds out the Scots and the Welsh are causing trouble, so Henry's like, darn, well, I guess I can't fight a holy war. His mate Westmoreland is like, yeah, sorry, that guy Glendower and his men are powerful and we need to put all our energy into squashing them. Then we hear about a young nobleman called Henry Percy, nicknamed Hotspur, who is about the same age as Hal. He has just defeated a bunch of the guys causing all the trouble, and Henry's all, dang it, why can't my kid be as cool as Hotspur? He managed to take a buttload of prisoners, but refuses to give them up, adding insult to injury for our frustrated king. So, next, we meet the king's son, Prince Hal. He is just low-key hanging out and day-drinking, messing with his mate Falstaff, an old drunk highwayman. Hal is like your equivalent of a trust fund frat boy who is bored of being rich, so he finds less savoury ways of entertaining himself. The scene begins when Falstaff asks Hal what time it is, and insults go flying, as the two behave like any two drunk lads in a bar would. Hal says, why the heck do you care about what time of day it is? You have no use for it. You are too busy drinking and eating and sleeping during the day to care. More insults fly. Details on these in the insult section at the end. Next, they are joined by their mate Poins, who tells them where the best catch people to rob will be. Poins tells them there are pilgrims going to Canterbury with rich offerings and traders riding to London with fat purses. Travelling anywhere back then was always dangerous, as you opened yourself up to thieves and highwaymen who waited for vulnerable people to rob. Hal isn't convinced he wants to be involved, but Poins sends Falstaff away so he can convince Hal to do it, and plans a brilliant prank on Falstaff. He's like, Hal, mate, you can chop my head off if we don't pull this off. When Falstaff and the other idiots are robbing the pilgrims and traders, we will be waiting for them, and then we will ambush them and steal the loot ourselves. After much convincing, Hal agrees to this idea and Poins leaves to set up for the robbery. Hal then makes a speech about how he's badly behaved now, but when it comes time to actually take the crown, his current bad behaviour is going to make his reformation look even better. This is a good hint for what's to come for our young princeling / trust fund frat boy. I'm now attached to this idea and will keep it going throughout the podcast. Fair warning. Next, we are back with King Henry, who is in a mood, as we meet the infamous Harry Hotspur. Harry is getting a royal telling off for not releasing his prisoners from the battle to the king, to which he replies, look, I had just finished an exhausting bloody battle, and while my soldiers were moving all the dead, some posh dude came up to me and started insulting me and my soldiers, and then asked me for the prisoners. I was not in the mood for his attitude, so I refused him. Then the king pesters him further about his bro-in-law Mortimer, one of the prisoners he was refusing to give up, and Hotspur begins to sing his praises. Back then, I guess people still liked their in-laws. Turns out Mortimer is the next, quote, rightful heir to the throne, and Henry wants him out of the way so no one can question his legitimacy. It isn't easy being a king. So Hotspur, after leaving the king, basically spends the rest of the scene slagging him off with his dad, Northumberland, and his uncle Worcester, and saying how awful he is and how bad he feels that he was once polite to him. The king properly wound him up, which, to be fair, isn't hard. His name says it all. He is hot-headed Hotspur. Here you have the hard-working, middle-class student who is trying non-stop to do what he thinks is the right thing. I mean, we have seen this story time and time again. Keep your eye on the stage, guys. I'll be doing this production one day. And you thought the histories were boring! The next scene opens with two couriers moaning about the horrible night they just spent at the inn. Imagine those awful motels where they never changed the sheets, but before hygiene was a thing. Nor were proper toilets. Gross. They are getting ready to meet up with some, well, for lack of a better word, rich people on their way to London. Now, back then you didn't just hop on a train to London or drive, you were in a carriage drawn by 1 or 2 horses and not well protected. Enter Gadshill, one of Falstaff's men, and a chamberlain, an assistant at the inn, who is helping Gadshill with the robbery. They are toying with the 2 couriers who will be helping a few franklins, or non-noble landowners, transport their money. Gadshill leaves the chamberlain, promising him a cut of the profits, which he doesn't hold his breath for. Remember in Macker's, Macduff Jr. saying there are enough liars and thieves to hang all honest men? Most of this play is case in point. Next comes the robbery. Listen, this is probably the most ridiculous robbery you will ever hear about. I could put an absurd amount of the aftermath of the scene into the insult section. You know what, I could do that with most of the scenes from this play, but that's not important. Think of this as a massive American frat house hazing ritual, as Hal and Poins torture Falstaff and the others for their own entertainment. My brilliant metaphor continues to hold up. The 2 separate from the rest of the group as they go off to set up for the robbery, then disguise themselves and rob Falstaff and the rest of the gang, simply for sake of argument for a week, laughter for a month, and a good jest forever. Argument here meaning conversation. So, just to clarify here, the robbers rob themselves for fun. What the hell? Next, we go back to our hot-headed Hotspur, preparing for battle and reading a letter from someone. We don't know who, and it is pissing him off. Whoever wrote to him has no faith in his battle plan. This is the guy who's just praised in Act 1 for his prowess or skill in battle. The writer is basically saying he has no confidence in him and Harry is having none of it. Clearly his wife noticed something has been up with him as she comes in questioning him, asking him what is going on and why he's been dismissive of her. In typical male fashion, he ignores her and brushes her off. Lady Percy gets my award here for one of the sassiest female Shakespearean characters in the canon. She comes back at him with, "Come, come, you parakeeto, answer me! And out, you mad-headed ape! A weasel hath not such a deal of temper, as you are tossed within faith." I mean, you have to love her. For once, the woman is telling off the man for his temper, and not the other way around. Eventually, he tells her she can follow him the next day. So, I guess in the end, Hotspur is a bit of a gent. We next return to Hal and his pals post-robbery. First, we see Hal and Poins mess with the poor barman named Francis, who, bless him, isn't the sharpest tool in the shed, just to pass time. Then the 2 of them have Falstaff recite his side of the robbery. Again, this is all just like frat house hazing. Falstaff goes on for ages about how cowardly Hal and Poins have been for skipping the robbery. He gets to the part of the story where he was robbed, and as he goes adds more attackers to make himself look more heroic. It goes from 2 all the way up to 12 before Hal stops him and says he can't take it anymore and tells him the truth about what happened. Falstaff once again jumps to his own defence, saying, instincts must have kicked in, and he must have known it was Hal, and he didn't want to strike the future King of England in defence and accidentally injure him. This, of course, is told with a slew of insults from both parties, calling each other fat, skinny, drunk, old, and a number of less polite things. Then, after a messenger from Hal's dad shows up to try and drag him back to court, Falstaff and he decide to do some role-playing as practice for when Hal meets with his dad. Falstaff pretends to be Henry IV and Hal himself. This ends up being decidedly unproductive, as it just ends up with the two of them insulting each other and Falstaff bigging himself up. After this, you would think the scene would be over, but no! Next, the sheriff comes a knocking looking for Falstaff in relation to the robbery. Falstaff hides while Hal gets rid of the sheriff by telling him Falstaff has gone out on an errand. He swears to return the money and all is somewhat well. Hal returns into the tavern to find Falstaff asleep behind the arras, a hanging tapestry. And we are back to Hotspur, and what then became known as the rebel army, those who are fighting against King Henry. Sound like any other rebels you know? In space? With lightsabers? I'm telling you, these stories have been told time and time again. They change and grow, but the basic premise is the same. The group consists of Harry Hotspur, Lord Mortimer, Hotspur's brother-in-law, Worcester, his uncle, and Lord Glendower, who is the leader of the gang and Mortimer's father-in-law. Complicated, I know. It's almost as bad as Game of Thrones. Hotspur, then being the hothead he is, begins to wind up Glendower by dissing him, which is a bad idea because he's kinda a magician and they need his help. They then begin to divide up the country between each of them and Mortimer, his brother-in-law, for after they defeat Henry. Hotspur gets all up in arms about the division of the land, moaning that there's a thumping great big river dividing up all the good bits of his land. So he decides that the best option is to divert the river. Again, winding up Glendower, but Glendower decides to let Harry win this one and gives him permission to divert the river and leaves. Harry gets a telling off and then the wives enter. Mortimer's wife is Welsh and doesn't speak any English, and Mortimer speaks no Welsh. Odd piece of comic relief from old Shaky here. She sings a song in Welsh and Harry thinks it's a fun idea to have his wife do the same. Needless to say, that doesn't go down well and Kate refuses. Next, we have Hal getting his bottom... Wait, no, wrong play. Sorry. I can't think of a good pun here, sorry guys, but he's getting his butt handed to him by his dad, King Henry. He's basically saying Hal's got to pull himself together because the country is in the middle of a civil war. Hal quickly apologises and promises to do better. Of course, King Henry's the dad. He knows better than to take an apology that easy, so he draws it out more by saying that he reckons Hal would sooner join up with Hotspur, the enemy, than help him. What a guilt trip. I would like to say he wins the prize for best Shakespearean parental guilt trip, but he isn't even close to some of the other terrible parents Shakespeare writes. Hal then properly grovels and swears that he will either kill Hotspur on the battlefield or die trying. I once again picture some rich trust fund college kid going to his dad, the president of the school board, and getting told to get his act together or else. Clearly, I haven't thought about this at all. Next, we return to Falstaff and his mates. He's been given a promotion and put into the army. He is at their usual tavern with their mate Bardolph moaning about having his pocket picked. This was of course done by Hal after he fell asleep behind the arras. He swears he lost loads of money and a ring worth almost £1, around £600 today, blaming the mistress of the house, Mistress Quickly. She swears up and down she questioned everyone and no one knows anything. Falstaff starts on accusing Hal when who should walk in but the prince himself. Falstaff immediately starts taking back what he was saying. Of course, no one lets him get away with that, and they all jump on the bandwagon of making sure Hal knows how rude Falstaff was being about him. Nah, man, nah, I swear, I never said that. You're my mate, of course I'd trust you. Oh, are you kidding me? You was just swearing up and down you were the dirtiest thief of all of us. And so on. I mean, frat boys, am I right? So, it continues as Mistress Quickly and Bardolph rag on Falstaff, who had been very rude about them, so fair play. They tell Hal that Falstaff swore he owed him £1,000. This from the guy who owes money to every bar in town. To which he turns around and says, "No, you owe me your love. Your love is worth not just 1,000, but £1,000,000. Honestly, good comeback, mate. I respect that one. Eventually, Hal confesses to be the one who pickpocketed him, and all is suddenly forgiven, seeing as he can't really be mad at the future king. Of course, Hal knows that there was absolutely nothing of worth in his pockets too. Hal gives Falstaff and Bardolph their marching orders for battle, and he rides off with one of the lads called Peto. Here is where we start to see Hal slowly begin to claim his place as a leader. But he's not there yet. He's still just your frat boy who's behaving because Daddy said so, and out of a sudden need. Had there not been a war on, I wonder if Hal would have changed at all. Next, we're back to Hotspur, who was having a day with a capital D. Kind of like poor old Mackie at the end of his play. He just keeps getting bad news after bad news. First, his dad sends him a letter and says he's way too sick to come and that he doesn't feel like anyone else can lead his troops, so they aren't coming. Hotspur's very good at going from saying and thinking, "Oh God, we are sunk," to being like, no, it's cool, we got this, we absolutely got this. Then, worse news. Their mate Glendower, the Welsh guy who Harry couldn't stop insulting earlier on, now can't get his troops together in time. So they're down by a lot of people. Still, he remains positive, saying, "Nah, we're strong, we can take them, no question." He hears the king himself is riding, and that Hal, the prince everyone thought was a useless drunk, is also riding like feathered Mercury, the Roman god of messengers and commerce. We now return to our mate Falstaff, who is thoroughly enjoying his newfound power. He bosses Bardolph around and then moans how terrible his soldiers are. Apparently, most of them are ex-cons who are half-starved and ancient. He doesn't trust a single one of them to protect him in battle, although he's the one that hired them. On walks Hal, who comments on the very same thing, how poor and skinny they look. Falstaff basically says it's fine, they're perfect for war. They're so close to death anyways, they can just fill in the pit where they battle. We can use them as human shields. If you're a Star Trek fan, these are the red shirts, the Expendables. It's a pretty awful statement, but of course, with Falstaff saying it, it somehow comes out funny, especially seeing as he is the opposite, fat, overfed, and, while not wealthy, he's a thief, so he lives quite well. That, and he's more likely to save his own skin than anyone else's. He certainly wouldn't be on the front lines of battle. That's about it for the scene, as they... That, and he's more likely to save his own skin than anyone else's. That's about it for the scene as they head off to battle. Next, we're back to Hotspur and his compatriots. Harry wants to go into battle tonight as he continues to live up to his hot-headed name. He and one of his men, Douglas, the Scottish contingent, think it's smarter to go now, but the other two with him are like, "No way!" They all argue until they are interrupted by one of the king's men, a man called Sir Walter Blunt, who comes in to basically say, "Why the hell are you mad at the king? He's a good guy and wants to talk this through." And Hotspur's like, "Okay, well, first, my father has helped your king for years. He literally is the reason he made it this far. He helped him when he was returning as an outlaw to the country, lent him money, and helped him rebuild his reputation off the back of his own. Only after he swore all he wanted was his land and his title back. Hotspur continues to explain how he then starts complaining about the current king, saying how he is doing the country wrong. So, of course, the people follow him and depose the king. This was Richard II, if anyone's curious. I'll be doing a podcast on this play at some point. He then has the king killed and all his supporters killed. Blunt, the messenger, does jump in once or twice, but hot-headed Hotspur will not be interrupted when he's in a mood. He goes on. He says the king was then rude and distrusting of him and his father, the guy who got him where he is, and they got so fed up that they decided to join the rebels, and now have decided that he has no legitimate claim to the throne, which, actually, historically speaking, is quite true. So, after that, Blunt is like, "Right, so you want me to tell that to the king?" And he's like, "Nah, man, I just said all that because I was mad. My uncle is going to visit the king tomorrow and talk to him." He's hot-headed Hotspur, so Blunt doesn't question him any further. This next scene is what we in the biz call exposition. I'm sure no one's ever heard of that. We have the Archbishop giving letters to Sir Michael for various important people. They discuss each side's powers and how terrible it is that both Hotspur's dad, Northumberland, and Glendower, two of Percy's major forces, aren't coming to help, and the king has got loads of help. The Archbishop is trying to find as many people as he can to help Hotspur, mostly to save his own skin. We now return to the king and Hal and their party. Hal and his dad start the scene in the most English way imaginable. They discuss the weather. Some things never change, guys. As promised, in walk Hotspur's uncle, Worcester, and his mate Vernon to talk to the king. They tell the king they weren't looking to get into this fight. When the king questions this, they go through basically all the same things Hotspur said to Blunt about how they helped him and how he was an ungrateful brat, and so on. Henry basically says that this is all lies that he has drummed up to gain a following for his rebellion. Hal chimes in with a more level-headed attitude, saying how much he respects Hotspur as a soldier and a man, bringing up his own failures, basically saying, "Look, guys, he's better than me, I know that. I've been an idiot, I respect him, I don't want to fight him." Henry promises then to pardon everyone now if they call off this rebellion. As the two men leave to bring this news to Hotspur, Hal and his dad both feel that he will not agree to the terms they've been given, and prepare for war. Falstaff chimes in and asks Hal to protect him in the field if he falls. Hal says he owes God a death, so if he does fall in battle, it is right. Falstaff shockingly disagrees and then goes on to talk about honour. Everyone wants it, but if you have to die to get it, who does that help? He describes honour as a mere human construction. It helps no one, it can't heal a wound, it's just an idea to hide behind, so he will have nothing to do with it. Worcester and Vernon return from their meeting with the king and discuss the outcome. They, mostly Worcester, think that while the king may say he will forgive their uprising, he will find another way to punish them later on down the line. Hotspur, however, they feel will be easily forgiven, seeing that he is young and impressionable, and all his actions can be blamed on the elders around him. So they decide to lie. They break the news to Percy that the king is ready for battle and will not yield. Harry then asks about Hal and what his attitude was. Vernon goes on to talk about Hal's praise of him and how honourably he spoke. He says Hal made a blushing cittle of himself, meaning he described himself modestly. Hotspur thinks nothing of this and replies that he will meet him on the battlefield the next day no matter what. He leaves with the line, "Esperance, Percy, and set on." Esperance here meaning an expectation of a good outcome. Now we are officially in the battle. Everything that happens here, imagine, is happening on one big field, and we are flitting between different views, like in a film. Douglas, one of Hotspur's men, meets Sir Walter Blunt on the battlefield, who is dressed as the king. Douglas buys the disguise. This is a time before selfies. No one knew what anyone looked like. He kills Blunt, but Hotspur comes on and breaks the news that he's not actually killed the king. Darn. Then we switch to Hal and Falstaff again in the midst of battle. Falstaff is tired and bored of this whole war business, and is getting a little concerned for his life. He throws in a lot of wordplay here that I'll break down later in the insult section, which, by the way, is going to be epic. Hal asks for Falstaff's sword, which he refuses to give up. He then offers him his pistol, Hal asks for Falstaff's sword, which he refuses to give up. He then offers him his pistol, which he says will sack a city. Turns out it's literally a bottle of sack, which Hal throws back at him, saying, "Now is not the time for joking!" To Falstaff, I don't think there ever is such a time. And he leaves. Falstaff's bravery is suddenly restored, and he says he will kill Percy if he crosses him. We next return to Hal, who is wounded, and his men are trying to get him to return to camp and recover. He, typical stubborn male that he is, refuses to go and wants to keep fighting. Switching sides, we go to Douglas, who is exhausted as there are so many men out there that are dressed like the king. He says they grow like Hydra's heads. If you aren't sure what a Hydra is, cast your memory back to your Disney days and remember the purple dragon Hercules fought. That's a Hydra. Chop one head off, 3 more grow in its place. Douglas is having a rough day, to say the least, and, of course, who should enter but the real king himself. They battle and Douglas begins to win, but Hal, of course, comes to his rescue. Hal begins to overtake and Douglas flees. Next, we have the ultimate battle between our two heroes, the one you have in all the superhero and Bond films. Except, which side do you choose? The good and evil aren't so cut and dry here. Needless to say, Hotspur falls and says he is food for before death cuts him off, and Hal finishes his line for worms, which, in a funny way, is a great metaphor for Hotspur, who, like his lines, were cut off too soon. In the midst of this, Falstaff has come on and, in mid-fight, decides to play dead to keep himself safe. Hal sees him and offers a tearful goodbye, believing his feigned death. They didn't know much about the body back then, so checking for a pulse wouldn't really have been a thing. I wonder how many alive people were thought dead back then because of this. Oh well, that's a subject for another day. He exits, and Falstaff pops up cheerily and decides that he's going to take credit for killing Percy. He stabs him a few more times to make it look real, and is about to take him away when on walks Hal and his brother John of Lancaster. Lancaster is like, "Bro, didn't you say he was dead?" And Hal's like, "Yeah, man, Falstaff, I swear you were dead last time I checked." And Falstaff is like, "Nah, man, both me and Percy were alive and out of breath, passed out. But we both got up and fought and I killed him." Hal doesn't buy this for a minute, but decides to let his pal get away with it. Falstaff requests an earl or a dukedom as a reward, and they all leave, Falstaff carrying the dead Hotspur off with him. This final scene isn't a massive wrap-up, as this is only part one, but it sets up what is to happen next. The defeat of the rebels is confirmed, most of them fled. Vernon and Worcester have been captured and are executed. The war isn't over yet though, as Percy's dad, Northumberland, and their mate Glendower still have their power. The royal family split up as each go to deal with various threats. Hal, now redeemed in his father's eyes, stays with him to travel to Wales to deal with Glendower. What happens next? You'll have to wait for my podcast on Henry IV Part 2, coming after Twelfth Night, which will be next. Or you can catch the Henriad at Shakespeare's Globe in London for £12.50 in total, if you see all 3 Henry plays in one day. Okay, the best part of the podcast is here! The insults! With a small space reserved for Falstaff's puns. First up, these lies are like their father that begets them, gross as a mountain, open, palpable. Why, thou clay-brained guts, thou knotty-pated fool, thou whoreson, obscene, greased tallow-catch. Hal to Falstaff, Act 2, Scene 4. Hal doesn't believe Falstaff's lies and says they are just like him, big as a mountain, open and visible. Then he calls him stupid in a few ways, the son of a woman of questionable values, rude, and the last one is basically calling him a fat catcher, or just fat. Fat jokes are rife in this play. This sanguine coward, this bed presser, this horseback breaker, this huge hill of flesh. More Hal insults to Falstaff, same act and scene. He calls him a red-faced coward, lazy, and fat a few more times. Falstaff's turn. "Splud, you starveling, you elf skin, you dried neat's tongue, you bull's pizzle, you stock fish. Oh, for breath to utter what is like thee, you tailor's yard, you sheath, you bowcase, you vile standing tuck." Slightly less inventive and yet more in a way. Falstaff finds about 7 different ways to call Hal small and skinny. This, when done right, has me absolutely roaring with laughter. That trunk of humours, that bolting hutch of beastliness, that swollen parcel of dropsies, that huge bombard of sack, that stuffed cloak bag of guts, that roasted Manningtree ox with the pudding in his belly, that reverend vice, that grey iniquity, that father ruffian, that vanity in years. So, this is a mountain of insults. A trunk of humours is basically a big wooden box of secretion or juice. Nasty image that. Bolting hutch is basically a massive sieve, and beastliness explains itself. Dropsies is an illness resulting in fluid retention. Sack is wine. Reverend Vice is basically the stage clown or buffoon in a vice play, but not in a good way. Grey Iniquity, again, is the stage clown representing the sin of vice. Vanity and Ruffian are two more characters in vice plays. I'm sensing a theme here. Basically, Hal, while pretending to be his father, is calling Falstaff the king and retainer of all vices. Did I not tell you guys this was going to be a corker of an insult section? And this is just one scene. Next up, why, what a wasp-stung and impatient fool art thou to break into this woman's mood. Northumberland to Hotspur, Act 1, Scene 3. So this one's quite rude towards women. Hotspur's dad is basically saying, why are you being all moody like a woman? I felt it was important to include this because of its misogynistic attitude towards women, but also how that's still an insult used today. If a man is extra emotional, he's called a woman. Right, that's it for the insults, and now we're on to the puns. If I travel but 4 foot by the square further, I shall break my wind. He means he'll be out of breath, but also, fart joke! Falstaff says to Hal, what mean you to colt me thus? In Act 2, Scene 2. Colt means to dupe or trick, and Hal replies, thou liest, thou art not colted, thou art uncolted. Colted here, meaning having a horse. He turns Falstaff's own words against him and steals the pun crown. Were it not here apparent that thou art heir apparent? If it weren't clear you were heir to the throne, what a pun. Splud, 'twas time to counterfeit, or that hot termagant Scot would have paid me. Scot and lot too. Here he's playing on the word Scot. The Scot he's talking about is Douglas, who he had just been fighting, but pretended to die to avoid being killed. He said he had to counterfeit, i.e. play dead, or the Scot would have settled him or killed him. Scot and lot was a local tax, but also means thoroughly, so he continues on the paying wordplay. Paying meaning settle a score, metaphorically and physically. Glendower, and sandy-bottomed 7 have I sent him bootless home and weather-beaten back. Hotspur replies, home without boots, and in foul weather too. How scapes he the agues in the devil's name? 3-1. This is probably my favourite pun of the whole play. Glendower says he sent someone bootless home, which is like saying he sent them home a loser, and, of course, Hotspur comes back with the obvious retort of, if he went home without boots, how did he avoid getting ill? It's priceless. Comedy gold right here. Put votes in for your favourite insult or pun on Twitter at plainterms. Thank you everyone for tuning in, and thank you once again to Ben and David Crystal for their fantastic website, shakespeareswords.com, which is an invaluable resource to anyone studying Shakespeare or trying to make a podcast about